Welcome back to IGCSE Science Academy. Hello everyone. Today we are diving into a critical mechanism of life, active transport. This falls under a larger unit on movement into and out of cells. While we have already discussed how molecules can drift from high to low concentration through diffusion, today we are looking at what happens when the cells need to go against the flow. Today we will discuss about definition, mechanism, protein carrier, root hair cells, importance, comparison with diffusion and osmosis. Let's get started. Unit overview, active transport 3.3. What is active transport? How active transport works? Protein carrier molecules, active transport as diffusion, root hair cells, ion uptake, active transport in animals, importance of active transport, exam focus and key terms. Today we are going to discuss all these topics. Part 1 from today's lesson is what is active transport? Definition, feature and energy from respiration. Now let's get the formal definition down. If you are taking notes, this is the one to highlight. Active transport. Active transport is the movement of particles through a cell membrane from a region of lower concentration to a region of higher concentration against a concentration gradient using energy released from respiration. We call this moving against a concentration gradient. Crucially, this process isn't free, it's required energy release from respiration. Point 1 against the gradient. Particles move from low to high concentration, the opposite direction to diffusion. This requires energy. Think of a crowded room. Diffusion is like people living in that crowded room for an empty hallway. Active transport is the opposite. It's like forcing more people into that already crowded room. Because you are going the wrong way, it requires effort. Point 2, that is energy from respiration. ATP produced by cellular respiration provides the energy needed to drive the protein carriers and pump molecules across. This is the energy currency of the cells, which is called ATP, produced during cellular respiration. If a cell stops respiring, for example, if it lacks oxygen, active transport will stop. This is a favorite trick question in exam, so remember, no respiration, no active transport. Number 3, that is protein carrier molecules. Specific protein carrier pumps in the cell membrane bind to the molecules or ions and use energy to change shape, transporting it across. The actual work horses, there are the main protein carriers, often called pumps. These are embedded right in the cell membrane. They don't just let things slide through, they bind to the specific molecule, change their own shape using energy and physically spit the molecule out the other side. Fourth point, that is selective and specific. Each carrier protein is specific to a particular molecule or ion. This gives the cell precise control over what it absorbs or expels. Finally, active transport is highly selective. A pump designed for glucose won't move sodium ions. This specifically gives the cell total control. It can decide exactly which nutrients to pull in and which waste product to pump out, regardless of how much is already inside or outside. To truly understand active transport, we have to look at it side by side with what we already know about diffusion and osmosis. The fundamental difference comes down to one thing, the concentration gradient. In diffusion and osmosis, particles move down a concentration gradient, no energy needed. Active transport forces particles to move against their gradient. The passive side, diffusion or osmosis. We have the passive process. Think of this like a ball rolling down a hill. It happens actually naturally and does not require any effort. High concentration, low concentration, down the gradient. Particles move down the gradient from a high concentration to low one. Because it's spontaneous processes, no energy ATP is required. This continues until everything is balanced out, or what we call equilibrium. And remember, standard diffusion does not need carrier protein to get the job done. So no energy required, spontaneous process continuous until equilibrium, no carrier protein needed for diffusion. Facilitate diffusion uses channels. The active side, that is active transport. Active transport, this is the opposite. This is like trying to push that ball back up the hill. Low concentration to high concentration against the gradient. We are moving from a low concentration to high concentration or against the gradient because we are fighting the natural flow. We must have energy in the form of ATP, which comes directly from cellular respiration. Unlike the passive side, the process actually works against equilibrium. It allows the cell to concentrate substances like stock filling nutrients even when there's already a load inside. To do this, the cell relies on those specific protein carrier molecules we mentioned earlier. So the points are: energy, ATP is required from cellular respiration, work against equilibrium, requires specific protein carrier molecules, can concentrate substances. The simplest way to remember if it for your exam: passive is a free ride moving down the gradient, active is a paid service moving up the gradient. Energy from respiration powers active transport. We have established that active transport requires energy, but where exactly does that energy comes from? It comes from cellular respiration. Active transport cannot happen without energy. This energy comes specifically from cellular respiration occurring in the mitochondria. As we can see in the chemical equation, the cell takes glucose and oxygen and breaks them down into carbon dioxide and water. The most important byproduct for us today is ATP. Think of ATP as a fully charged battery that the cell uses to pay for the movement of molecules against their gradient. So what is ATP? It stands for adenosine triphosphate, is the energy currency of the cell. It is produced during aerobic respiration in the mitochondria. When ATP is broken down, energy is released to power active transport. Why mitochondria matters? This is a classic IGCSE explained question. Cells that carry out lots of active transport, for example root hair cells, intestinal epithelial cells, kidney tubule cells, have many mitochondria to supply enough ATP for the process. Evidence from experiments: if respiration is inhibited, for example by removing oxygen or adding respiratory poison, active transport stops. This proves it requires energy from respiration, not just random movement. This proves that process is strictly dependent on the cell metabolic activity, not just simple physics like diffusion. Part 2 from today's lesson is how active transport works, the mechanism and protein carriers. Protein carrier molecules. As we know that active transport, the process that allows a cell to move substances against the gradient. So now what are protein carrier molecules? Protein carrier, also called carrier proteins or pumps, are embedded in the cell membrane. They are essential for active transport. Here is the step-by-step mechanism. How does this actually work? It's a 5-step process that functions a bit like a security gate. Step 1. The molecules or ions, for example glucose mineral ions, approaches the carrier protein on the low concentration side of the membrane. Step 2. The molecules binds to the specific receptor site on the carrier protein log and key specificity. Step 3. ATP from respiration is used, energy is transferred to the carrier protein. Step 4. The carrier protein changes shape, moving the molecules to the high concentration site. Step 5. The molecule is released into the region of higher concentration. The carrier protein resets. To truly understand these pumps, we need to look at their 5 defining characteristics. Properties of carrier proteins. First is specificity. Each protein Each carrier protein is shaped to fit one specific molecule or ion only. This is highly selective. Location embedded on the phospholipid bilayer of the cell membrane, spanning its full width. Shape change. They use energy to change conformation shape, physically pushing the substance across. Saturation. If all carrier proteins are in use, a rate of active transport cannot increase even with more molecules. Inhibition. Blocking respiration, no ATP stops the carrier, they cannot functioning without energy. Active transport requires energy, moves substances from low to high concentration, and relies entirely on these specific protein carriers to get the job done. Now let's see what is the difference between active and passive transport. Active transport is the movement of molecules across a membrane from a region of lower concentration to a region of higher concentration against the concentration gradient, often assisted by enzymes and requires energy. Passive transport is the movement of ions and molecules across the cell membrane without requiring energy. This is the key difference between active and passive transport. Active and passive transport are two main biological processes that play a crucial role in supplying nutrients, oxygen, water, and other essential molecules to the cells, along with the elimination of waste products. In essence, active and passive transport work for the same goals, purposes, but with different movement. Now let's look at this comparison diagram to see how these different transport methods look side by side. The cell membrane is highly selective, and as you can see, the direction of travel determines whether the cell can relax or if it has to do some heavy lifting. Active transport membrane diagram. The cell membrane controls what enters and leaves. Carrier proteins use ATP energy to pump substances against their concentration gradient. Section 1, that is passive transport. We have two types of passive transport. Notice the arrows, they are pointing downward from a high concentration to low concentration. First is diffusion or simple diffusion. Look at the small brown molecules. They are passing directly through the phospholipid bilayer. They don't need a door, they just squeeze through. Facilitated diffusion, high concentration gradient. Now look at the green triangles and pink circles. These are too large or charged to pass through the membrane alone. They need a facility, a protein channel or carrier to help them through, but crucially this is still passive. No energy is used because they are still moving down the concentration gradient. Section 2, that is active transport, low to high concentration gradient. Now look at this side of dashes line. This is active transport. Notice the big difference here. We are moving substances from low concentration to high concentration. We are essentially pushing things uphill. Because this is against the natural flow, you will see that red starburst. This represents ATP, chemical energy the cell must spend to force the carrier protein to change shape and pump those green and purple molecules across. Without ATP, this process simply wouldn't happen. So to summarize, if it goes with the flow, it's passive. If it goes against the flow, it's active. And that requires a pump and paycheck in the form of ATP. We have a question in our mind. Why is this important for the cell? Cell often need to hoard nutrients like glucose or maintain specific ions balances like the sodium-potassium pump, where the concentration inside the cell is already much higher than outside. Active transport is the only way to achieve this. Does the visual distinction between the channel in facilitated diffusion and the pumps in active transport make sense to you? Yes, it makes perfect sense. Think of it like the difference between a revolving door and hydraulic airlock. In facilitated diffusion, the channel is essentially a reserved door. It's open to anyone with the right key, and they just walk through with the crowd. In active transport, the pump is a mechanical gate that stays shut until you need it a coin, ATP. Only then does it physically move you to the other side against the pressure of the crowd. Part 3, Ion Uptake by Root Hair Cells, where we will discuss about importance of active transport in plants. Now let's look at the interface where the plant meets the earth, the root hair cell. These cells are the primary gateway for everything a plant needs to grow, specifically water and essential mineral ions like nitrates and magnesium. So let's discuss about the anatomy of the cell first. Notice the unique shape. Unlike a typical square plant cell, the root hair cell has a long thin extensions. This dramatically increases the surface area, allowing the cell to come in contact with more soil particles and the water film surrounding them. Inside you can see a large vacuole and the nucleus. But what's most important for ion uptake is the cell membrane just inside that cellulose. Here is the challenge. The concentration of mineral ions inside the plant is usually much higher than it is in the surrounding soil. If the plant relied on diffusion, these precious minerals would naturally leak out of the root. So to solve this, the plant uses active transport. Look at the root hair extension in the diagram. Embedded in that membrane are the protein carriers we discussed earlier. Using energy ATP produced by cells' mitochondria, these carrier grabs ions from the soil and pumps them into the cell against the concentration gradient. This is an effortful process for the plant, but it's the only way to ensure it gets enough nutrients to survive. The long hair creates large surface area to volume ratio for faster absorption. Water enters via osmosis or passive transport. Mineral ions enter via active transport. Active required energy. Since active transport requires energy, root hair cells are packed with mitochondria. If a soil becomes waterlogged or no oxygen, the roots can't respire, meaning they can't produce ATP, and mineral uptake stops entirely. This is why plants often drown in too much water. We have looked at the anatomy of root hair cell. Now let's discuss the why and how. Plants need minerals like nitrates for proteins and magnesium for chlorophyll, but getting them isn't always easy. So root hair cells ion uptake by active transport. Plant needs mineral ions, for example nitrates, phosphate, magnesium for healthy growth. These ions exist in the soil in very low concentration. Inside root cells, ion concentration is higher, so diffusion alone cannot get them in. The problem, the concentration gap. Mineral ions, nitrates, phosphates, magnesium in the soil are at lower concentration than inside the root cells. Diffusion only works down a concentration gradient. It cannot move ions into the cell against this gradient. Mineral ions in the soil are typically at very low concentration. Inside the root cells, the concentration is higher. If the plant relied on diffusion, it would be waiting forever for ions that would never come. In fact, they had tried to leave. Diffusion only works downhill, but the plant needs to move these ions uphill against the gradient. So what is the solution? The solution is, of course, active transport. Active transport carrier proteins in the root hair cell membrane pumps mineral ions from soil water, low concentration into the root cell, high concentration using ATP from respiration. The solution is active transport. The plant uses specialized carrier proteins to grab those ions from the soil water and pump them into the cell. This requires a fee in the form of ATP, energy generated from respirations. Here are the four key adaptations. Why are root hair cells especially adapted for active transports? So how is this specific cells hacked to be so good at this? There are four structural adaptations you need to know for your exams also. First is long hair like extensions. Massively increase surface area in contact with soil water, maximizing ion absorption. These are not just for show, they massively increase the surface area touching the soil, maximizing the space available for absorption. Second is many mitochondria produce large amount of ATP by aerobic respiration to constantly power the carrier protein pumps. Active transport is expensive. These cells are packed with mitochondria to produce the large amount of ATP needed to keep those pumps running 24/7. Many carrier proteins. High density of specific carrier proteins in the membrane, one for each type of mineral ion needed. The membrane has a high density of these gates. There are specific carrier for each type of ion, one for nitrates, one for phosphate, and so on. Thin cell wall and membrane. Short diffusion transport distance between soil water and cell cytoplasm, increasing efficiency. By keeping the barrier thin, the plant reduces the distance the ions have to travel, making the whole process much more efficient. So the plants are essential. To grow, they must maintain internal concentration of minerals that are much higher than the surrounding environment. This is why diffusion, passive movement, is physically impossible for minerals uptake in most soil. Why many mitochondria is a top exam answer whenever an IGCSE question asks why a cell is adapted for active transport. Many mitochondria is almost always a marking point. Mitochondria, site of aerobic respiration, produce ATP power carrier protein. So the hair extension isn't just longer, it changes the geometry of the cell. By having a high surface area, the volume ratio, the cell can absorb more material relative to its own size, preventing a bottleneck at the membrane. This diagram shows a root hair cell and how it absorbs minerals from the soil. Root hair cell. What is root hair cell? A root hair cell is a specialized plant cell found in the roots. It has a long, thin extension, the hair, which increases surface area for absorption. So what the diagrams show, the pink dots outside represent mineral ions in the soil. The arrows show minerals moving into the root hair cell. The inside of the cell already has some minerals, but more are being absorbed from the soil. So how minerals enter the cell? Minerals are absorbed by a process called active transport. As we have already discussed, movement against concentration criteria, minerals move from an area of low concentration, that is soil, to high concentration inside the cell. So the cell uses energy from the respiration, that is ATP, to take in minerals. Special proteins in the cell membrane help transport minerals inside. So why this is important? Plant need minerals like nitrates, magnesium and potassium for growth. Without this process, plant cannot make proteins or chlorophyll. Part 4, Importance of active transport. Here we will discuss why active transport is essential for life. Importance of active transport in animals. Active transport is essential wherever substances need to be moved against a concentration gradient in animal bodies. First is guts in small intestine. After digestion, glucose and amino acids in the gut lumen may be at lower concentration than in the blood. Active transport pumps them across intestinal epithelial cells into the bloodstream, ensuring complete absorption even when diffusion would fail. Second is nerve cells, neuron. Sodium potassium pumps actively transport sodium ions out in potassium ions into nerve cells. This creates and restores the resting potential needed for nerve impulses to be generated. Without this, nerves could not function. Thyroid gland. Thyroid cells actively accumulate iodide ions from the blood where concentration is low. To produce thyroid hormones, the concentration of iodide inside these cells is up to 50 times higher than in the blood. Kidney tubules. The kidney reabsorbs useful substances, glucose, amino acids, some salt from the filtrate back into the blood. This often works against a concentration gradient, so active transport is used. This prevents the body wasting important molecules. Muscle cells. Calcium ions are actively pumped back into the sacroplasmic reticulum after muscle contraction. This allows muscles to relax and be ready for the next contraction. Without active transport, muscles would stay in a contracted state. Red blood cells formation. During development, red blood cells use active transport to control their internal ion composition. This is critical for maintaining the correct osmotic balance and cell volume. So for all these kind of functions which are happening in our body, active transport is very important. Factors affecting the rate of active transport. The rate of active transport can be limited or increased by several factors. These are commonly tested in IGCSE exam questions. First is availability of ATP. Availability of ATP, more ATP, faster rate. If respiration is inhibited, for example, no oxygen, respiratory poison like cyanide, active transport slow then stops completely. Second is glucose availability, more glucose for respiration, more ATP produced, more energy for carriers. Glucose is the respiratory substrate that fuels the whole process. Oxygen concentration, aerobic respiration requires oxygen, more ATP produced, faster active transport. In anaerobic condition, much less ATP is made, limiting the rate. Temperature. Higher temperature, faster enzyme, catalyzed respiration, more ATP, faster rate. But above optimum carrier protein denatures and rate falls to zero. Number of carrier proteins, more carrier proteins in membrane, more molecules transported per second. But once all carriers are occupied, adding more substrate has no effect. Saturation. Concentration gradient, active transport moves against the gradient, so a steeper externally concentration drop actually requires more energy, not less. The cell must work harder. So these are the factors which affect the rate of active transport. Some important key terms and definitions from active side which are very important for your exam. First is active transport, movement of particles from a region of lower concentration to higher concentration against a concentration gradient through a cell membrane using energy from respiration. Second is protein carrier pump, a specific protein molecules embedded in the cell membrane that uses ATP energy to change shape and transport a specific molecules or ions across the membrane. Third is mineral ion, a charged particle, for example, nitrate, magnesium, and potassium needed by plant for healthy growth absorbed from the soil by root hair cells using active transport. Concentration gradient, the difference in concentration of a substance between two areas. Diffusion move down the gradient, active transport move against it from low to high. ATP, adenosine triphosphate, the energy currency of the cell produced during cellular respiration. ATP provides the energy for protein carrier to function during active transport. Mitochondria, organelle that carry out aerobic respiration producing ATP. Cells with high rate of active transport, root hair, gut epithelium contain many mitochondria. Mitochondria is also called powerhouse of energy. We have covered the how and the why, but now let's talk about the marks in biology. You can understand a concept perfectly but still lose points if you don't use the specific mark scheme language. Let's break down these essential exam tips. First, always say against the concentration gradient. When defining active transport, you must say it moves from low to high concentration or against the concentration gradient. Saying just required energy is not enough. State the energy source precisely. Don't just say energy. Say energy released from respiration or ATP from respiration. Examiners want to see you know the source. Mention protein carrier. For 3.3.3, state that protein carriers, not just proteins, move molecules across the membrane. This is a specific statement worth marks. Don't confuse with diffusion. Active transport goes low to high, diffusion goes high to low. A common exam mistake is reversing this. Remember, active against upfill needs energy. Don't forget mitochondria link. When asked why root hair cells have many mitochondria, say they carry out more respiration to produce more ATP for active transport of mineral ions. Root hair cell questions. For example, for 6-mark questions on ion uptake, explain the problem. Ions lower outside state, active transport is needed. Explain carrier proteins use ATP linked to mitochondria, state directions low to high. So these are some exam tips and common mistakes with mark scheme language. You need to ready for your exams with these exam tips and common mistakes. Here is the summary from active transport. Here are some questions. You need to read the questions and write the answers. These questions will help you to make notes. I'm just going to read the questions. It's your responsibility to read the answers and make notes for yourself. So use this slide for revision, cover the right column and try to recall each answer. Here are the questions. What is active transport? What provides energy for active transport? What are protein carriers? Why do root hair cells need active transport? Name 3 minerals ion absorbed by active transport. Why do root hair cells have many mitochondria? What happens to active transport if respiration is blocked? How does active transport differ from diffusion? Here we complete the unit. Active transport 3.3.1, 3.3.2 and 3.3.3. So we have covered definition, moment low to high, against concentration gradient using ATP, energy from respiration, mitochondria, ATP, carrier proteins, protein carriers, specific shape change mechanism, root hair cells, ion uptake, nitrate, phosphate, and magnesium, importance in animals, gut, kidney, nerves, comparison with diffusion and osmosis, factor affecting rate, evidence, and exam tips. And that brings us to the end of the today's lesson on the active sites. Make sure to like, share and subscribe to IGCSE Science Academy for more simple and exam-focused science lessons. Don't forget to hit the bell icon so you never miss an update. See you in the next lesson. Stay tuned and keep learning.